Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this evening's AgriSearch webinar on red clover establishment being held as part of our ZeroNsile project. First of all, a quick reminder of what AgriSearch is. We are an independent farmer-led levy body. Our purpose is to make the Northern Ireland livestock sector more competitive, profitable and sustainable, and we put a very strong emphasis on-farm research and innovation, providing that connection between farming and science. So why ZeroNsile? High quality silage is of great importance for livestock farmers. Recent years have seen increased costs and price volatility in manufactured fertilisers, placing an additional cost burden on farmers. In addition, fertiliser use accounts for around 20% of greenhouse gas emissions on Northern Ireland's ruminant livestock farms. Plot and field studies at Hillsborough and other research institutes have shown that red clover-based swards can give high dry matter yields and high levels of protein without the use of manufactured nitrogen fertilisers. However, there is little experience of growing red clover silage swards on many farms in Northern Ireland, particularly in the west. 12 farms were selected from our GrassCheck and Beacon Farm networks to take part in the trial. Swards were established on 11 farms during the last year, and this will be our first year of intensive monitoring of the swards. In addition, there is also a small Lucerne component to this project, and 3 farmers in County Tyrone established Lucerne last year. Tonight's webinar is to brief you on the key things you will need to get right to successfully establish and manage red clover silage swards. Our keynote speaker, Dr. David Patterson, grassland scientist at AFBI Hillsborough, who acts as a scientific advisor and consultant to the project, will be speaking on this. We'll also hear from 2 farmers, David Clarke and Stephen Maguire, who are involved in the project, on their experiences of establishing and managing red clover. Before I start, just want to go over some housekeeping issues. You're automatically muted. You can use the Q&A function to ask questions, not the chat box. You can upvote questions that you want answered. If you have any issues with your connection, then leaving and joining will usually fix them. The webinar will be recorded and will be available on the AgriSearch YouTube channel during the coming days. Also, at the end, please complete the feedback survey, which will come up automatically at the end of the webinar. This helps us to deliver better webinars in the future. So without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. David Patterson from AFBI Hillsborough to speak to us on the establishment of red clover. David graduated from Queen's University with a degree in agriculture and also obtained a PhD on grass clover sward dynamics. He then worked for Queen's University as a turfgrass breeder at Loughgall before taking up a grassland technologist post at Greenmount. After working in various roles in the department, he finally came back to Grass in January 2018 to take up the post of Grassland Agronomist at AFBI Hillsborough. So David, I will hand over to you now to do your presentation.
Well, good evening, everyone. I have to say the last 10 minutes has been more stressful than it should have been. Jason did tell me earlier that there was over 165 people that had signed up to the talk for this evening, so I can only assume there's about 100 of those must be Manchester United supporters that can't dare to look at the TV tonight. So anyway, the ZeroNsile project that Jason has just introduced, AFBI are involved in. Obviously, what I want to do tonight is basically run through some practical, technical findings to do with red clover establishment underpinned with science, and basically run through some background, some details on the establishment, and finishing off with early management of the red clover crop. Next slide, please, Jason. So first of all, I thought I'd just throw up some pros and cons. These are some of my own opinions, some opinions from the literature, and anecdotal as well. Some of the pros that you might be familiar with. It can fix atmospheric nitrogen from the air. You probably all know that. It's potentially a high yielding crop of over 15 tons of dry matter per hectare per year, 3 or 4 cuts of silage, for instance. High animal intakes and performance, and also from an environmental point of view, improved soil structure, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on. On the con side, and these are opinions and some more factual than others. Persistency is an issue. It is a relatively short-lived species. At the end of the day, 4 to 5 years at most, and then you're thinking about starting again, or if you're part of rotation, to move on to other ground. A 4-year break is also needed after the red clover has been in the ground for that period of time, and this is to prevent any build-up of the likes of stem mealworm or clover rot. Can be difficult to ensile. I have a question mark over that, because I'm sure that there's ones in the audience who have already ensiled successfully red clover and grass red clover mixtures quite successfully, but it is a little bit different in terms of the process. And less suitable for grazing. It's maybe not so relevant to our title for our talk tonight, but it wouldn't just survive repeated trampling, for example. In terms of this second slide, just to allay some of those fears, silage without fertiliser cannot be done. And there was a plot trial done at Hillsborough some years ago, and you can see there 4 years of results, the first 4 years of a plot trial, where we compared yields of perennial ryegrass, hybrid, Italian, white clover and red clover. The 2 bars that are on the graph, the orange bars are the Italian ryegrass pulled out of the data. The black bars are the red clover. So you can see straight away, year 1 and year 2, the red clover was out yielding even Italian ryegrass. And why I picked out Italian is because Italian is a bit similar in terms of its cutting pattern throughout the growing season, in terms of slightly shorter cutting intervals. Year 3 and year 4, no significant differences, but it allays to some extent the fear of poorer productivity over 4 years at least. And when you look at the 4-year average, just back a second there, just at the chart to the right-hand side, the overall 4-year yield average, everything was compared to perennial ryegrass at 10 tons, but the hybrid was slightly higher. The Italian was about 30% higher, and red clover at the bottom there was 45% higher. So it was 14 tons versus 10 tons for a perennial ryegrass sward. And that was obviously in a plot study without any trampling or grazing or any of that. Next slide, please. Thinking again about silage productivity, results in from trials down south from Chagas, and these were over 6 years. So again, this is productivity, the con about productivity and the con about persistency being addressed here. Grass red clover swards with 0 fertiliser nitrogen produced similar dry matter yield to grass only with over 400 kilograms of nitrogen, which is a mighty amount of nitrogen to be put on across the grazing season. In this particular study, they achieved 15.8 tons of dry matter over the season for the grass red clover, 15.7, slightly lower for the fertilized grass only sward. So marginal differences in terms of output, but a massive difference in terms of the fertilizer requirement. They also found in those studies in Chagas that the earlier harvest contributed to holding on to a better content or better red clover content in the sward, 62% versus 46. And you might think those are relatively subtle dates, 26th of May to the 11th of June, but a lot can happen in terms of the grass component growing alongside the clover and overtopping and outcompeting the red clover at that critical stage of the early summer. Third point there, red clover content and herbage production, again, were greater when there was 0 nitrogen applied. I mean, absolutely 0 fertilizer nitrogen. Achieved 61% clover with 15 tons of dry matter. And even if you're only putting on 50 kilograms of nitrogen, there's only a couple of bags applied per hectare, 48%. It depressed the clover content and slightly less production overall. Okay, next slide, please, Jason. And fast forwarding, this is the end product. This is what it looks like. Your red clover silage. This was a big bale just opened there at the weekend. It was a 22 sown field, sown in July of that year. Bring it on 1 year. It was a first cut harvest in around last days of May 23. So what you've got there, you can see just what I'm trying to show in the photograph, the preserved blackened red clover leaves, and that's what you're after in the silage. If you don't see those, will then, they've either shattered in the field or got broken up or whatever, but those are where the protein and the other very digestible nutrients are contained, and that's what you want to see in your silage. It'll be a different color of silage, and additive is generally required or needed, but that's what the end product should look like. Next slide, please. Getting back to establishment, I thought I would throw in this photograph, this diagram of a stylized red clover plant, but it just brings home the point for us all. It's a very much more upright or erect standing plant compared to white clover. You can see up from the top down there, you've got the leaflets up around the top and the petioles, right down to this crown material, which is almost like the brain of the plant, sitting there almost at ground level. And that can be its Achilles heel to some extent, in that crown tissue is quite exposed to tramping and damage and so on. On the positive side, below that, you've got a very strong taproot, and that's what contributes to the improvements to soil structure, for example, and soil health. But looking through some of the tips on the left-hand side for as far as establishment goes, which is what we're really wanting to talk about tonight, I think that it's a bit of a shopping list there, but it's all I could think of to put onto one slide. Starting off with sward kill, you must get rid of. I don't care whether you're coming through from cereal, coming through from grass to grass, or coming through from maybe some sort of root crop. You will have to do a roundup kill of all existing vegetation to give the new crop every possible chance. And there may even have been herbicides applied to a previous cereal crop or grass crop to get really good control of weeds, for example, trying to control docks and thistles and chickweed in grass-only fields in the years prior to trying to switch over to red clover. After that, it's conventional cultivation. I have no particular bias, whether it's ploughing, disking, power harrowing, or some combination of those. It's all about trying to get that fine, firm seed bed. And I'm talking about it's a tabletop finish you should be aiming for, and every bit as firm as that as well. Stale seedbed technique is mentioned there. You could spend all night talking about that, but that's basically a system where you're trying to exhaust some of the population of weed seeds that are sitting just subsurface, in that sort of 25 to 50 mil depth of soil right at the surface. Essentially, stale seed bedding is doing all of that cultivation and tabletop finish, and don't put the seed in, and wait for germination of inevitably the grass weeds, the broadleaf weed seedlings that'll come up through, and then spray those off again. It's a good technique. It's a great way of getting, like I say, exhaustion or removal of quite a proportion of those weed seeds. But it delays the whole process, and that's the downside of it. It can only really be done if you start early enough in the season with the cultivation work. Moving on, second point there, overseeding. It's less, red clover is generally less suitable to stitching in or overseeding or broadcasting than white clover seed. I've put the word distribution there as a reminder, because red clover the seedlings will grow where the seeds have been deposited. Okay, it's not like white clover where it's a lot more forgiving, where white clover will get established and maybe move into bare spaces. This red clover will not. It just grows where you have sown it, so it's less suited to overseeding. Fine, firm seed bed we've already talked about. One thing to emphasize there: there's a lot more rolling involved. Rolling prior to seeding and then rolling again afterwards, at least, to make sure we get the seed placed at the surface and it stays at the surface, and not buried and covered in too deep. 5 to 10 mil maximum for sowing depth. I would say aim to put the seed right on the top, and inevitably some will go a bit deeper than that, so you'll end up at 5 to 10 mils anyway. And just a reminder there, the seed size, it's about 3 times the size of white clover, but doesn't really matter. It's still a very, very tiny seed. Just really the tip of your biro pen is about the size of the seeds themselves. In terms of timing of doing this operation, you could do your cultivation, your spray off and your cultivations ahead of this, but you need about 8 degrees C soil temperature near the surface for germination. So you're really in the north, you're really talking about late April, mid-late April onwards, I would say, and ideally not any later than late June. Yes, there's been plenty of examples of successful red clover grass reseeds that have gone in after that. I have some experience of some myself, but as a rule, I would try and aim at least to do it before the longest day. In terms of mixtures, and we'll get a bit more detail on that in a moment, but roughly speaking, you're talking about 9 or 10 kilos of grass with 4 kilos of red. That's kilograms per acre in this case, as is the way seeds are sold. And if it was a monoculture, by comparison, we'd be talking about 6 kilos red. In the ZeroNsile Project, and what Stephen and David will talk about, are grass red clover mixtures, just to be clear about what the what the project is focusing on. In terms of grass companions, we're generally looking at hybrid ryegrasses and perennial ryegrass as well. Soil pH is a big topic for tonight, and I'll keep repeating myself about it because it's that important. But we should be aiming to get up to at least 6.5. And there's good reasons for that, and it's not just to get the fertility of the soil up. So we'll come back to that. Seedbed fertilizer, you only need P and K, not nitrogen. Nitrogen at the seedbed stage is very good at growing grass weeds and very good at growing weed seedlings, and that's what you'll get a pollution of across your freshly prepared seedbed. So whatever you do, cut down on or zero nitrogen going on in the seedbed. Next slide, please, Jason. And just to bring it into reality, you can see in the left-hand photograph, Stephen with his back to us there, showing us his field that was sown, I think, in May 23, and we were looking at that in the latter part of the summer. It was maybe mid-late September. And it was a pretty successful establishment. I'll let him talk more about that later on. The two photographs on the right, David kindly sent in recently there from his, I think it was a June plough and reseed when the seed went in June last year. And you can see he's found another use for that spade lying at the back of the shed. But you can see hopefully on the spade photograph, that's less than a year old clover plant, and you can see it's got quite a good depth of taproot, a bit like the example in the diagram on the previous slide, and the clover leaves just sitting above ground surface at this time of year. I think that photograph was taken maybe within the last fortnight or so. The right-hand side is the take-home photograph, really. That's what the clover roots and deeper rooting is doing for the soil. Soil structure, first of all, you can see it's a very open, friable soil there. And, you know, there's a lot of talk these days about improving soil biodiversity. You can see a worm there, Jason. Maybe if you can highlight, there's a worm just off center in that photograph there. You're improving the soil biodiversity and the macro and microorganisms that are in there by having the deeper rooting, by opening up the soil structure, and also, you know, in terms of resilience and climate adaptation and all of that, you've got a soil type there that can ride out both short-term periods of drought because you've got the deeper rooting going further down to get reserves, and also periods of waterlogging should allow that type of soil profile for the water to infiltrate and percolate down through, giving you a faster infiltration rate of rainfall, making the sward much more usable. Now, a little sideways point on an establishment, and I thought this was worth emphasizing. We talk about nitrogen fixation, but what actually is going on there? It's biological nitrogen fixation, or BNF for short. The air, as you probably know, has got Jason will probably Google this for me, but I think it's about 78% nitrogen content. The rhizobia, the little swellings, little nodules on the roots of the clover plants, they are able to fix that atmospheric nitrogen, transfer it to the clover root, which in turn gets transferred into the soil, and then is available for uptake by both the clover and the grass plants. And then eventually that material, that herbage, is either eaten or it's either grazed or eaten as silage later on. So that's the sort of the pathway. And it all starts with those little insignificant looking little swellings on the roots of the clover plants. And if you have clover in your fields at home, go get the spade out, dig it up, and just see if you can find any of those little, they're like 1/10 the size of a pea on the root. And I've invented this sort of Clover 50 rule. This is based on some research done down at Solihull, which they're really pioneering a lot of really good work on red clover research. But the scenario there is for 15 tons of dry matter, you can see the work example for yourselves, with 30% clover content, that's 5 tons of clover dry matter produced across the growing season with 0 fertiliser. Okay, now what does that fix and contribute to the soil? That's the Clover 50 rule. 5 tons of dry matter times 50 gives you 250 kilograms of nitrogen transferred into the soil, available nitrogen. Now 250 kilograms of nitrogen fertiliser is roughly the equivalent of that. The advantage of this type of nitrogen, that's being spoon-fed right the way through the growing season. So as long as the growth conditions are right and it's daytime when the plants are photosynthesizing and soaking up nutrients out of the soil, that 250 kilograms of nitrogen across the growing season is being made available. So that's the power that clover has to contribute. But again, I'm backtracking a little bit there. It must be the 0 fertiliser nitrogen. As soon as you put on fertiliser, you're already inhibiting it. You're turning off the biological nitrogen fixation. You will certainly fertilise the clover and you'll fertilise the grass, and they'll grow well, but you're switching off, you're turning off the tap of biological nitrogen fixation. So anyway, that's all good. The Clover 50 rule. Bit of a gimmick, but it drives home the point. The but coming at the bottom of the slide is very important as well. pH 5. Anybody got a pH 5 soil out there? 5 point something. At pH 5.0, there is no biological nitrogen fixation happening. Nothing. And that's even if you have clover present in the sward. Because what the clover at pH 5, you may have clover, but it will not be doing any fixing. It'll just have to rely on fertiliser and slurry that you're applying, just like grass. So there's a few take-home messages even on that one slide in terms of productivity and making sure you get the pH up. In the south, they're even advocating pH 7 right now for committed grass clover swards. And pH 7 biologically is the ideal, is the perfect pH for maximizing your biological nitrogen fixation. Anyway, I think I've made the point. Move on, please, Jason. Back to establishment, weed control. If I didn't have it on the con slide at the start, I probably should have, but it can be a problem in these swards if, for instance, there's a takeover with docks or with chickweed, maybe in the earlier stages of the crop, establishment-wise. First point on the list there, the ideal scenario is to have the ground well and truly cleaned. By that I mean free of docks as far as possible, or thistles or chickweed in the previous years. So if you've got a dock-infested grass field, that is not the field to try and cultivate this spring. It would almost take a year of dock treatments followed by a spring roundup the following spring to try and eradicate and get rid of dock problems before you start into red clover. There's a number of points there on post-emergent sprays. I have to say at the top there is a real limitation on reliable post-emergent sprays, as in there's only one product out there in the market. We're not pushing it, and There was a promise of another brand new one coming on the market this year. It hasn't come. Pro Clover was being advocated as the best post-emergence spray that will be coming along in 2024. It hasn't appeared. But it may be a bit academic for tonight, but I'll take you through the steps of if a post-emergence spray does become a really good one, becomes available this season, and fingers crossed it will. I'll take you through some of the steps of when to use it. Typically, it's used 6 to 8 weeks after the seed has gone into the ground. And I have a couple of photographs coming up to show that. The Clover product, surprise, surprise, must be Clover safe. You double, triple check the label and talk it thoroughly through with the merchant or the supplier. The target is to apply the post-emergence when the majority of the clover seedlings have reached the trifoliate stage. It's a 3-leaf plant, as you know, and the docks are at a critical size as well, about the size of a £2 coin. If you spray too early, you'll kill clover seedlings. If you spray too late, the canopy is closed over, and a lot of the target docks that you're trying to get at, the wee seedling docks, have got protection and shaded and cover in the more advanced sward canopy, and you'll still have problems with docks later on after that. In terms of chickweed, getting away from the chemicals for a moment, chickweed and other soft weeds, 1 or 2 what I call fast grazings can normally clean those up, and that means a lot of mouths. It could be sheep or calves or whatever, but a lot of mouths on the field for a short period of time to get a lot of that poor material grazed off. Another alternative, which I haven't listed here, is to let that grow and take quite an early, maybe an early cut of big bale silage or something off it, just to get all of that material literally decapitated and get it taken off the sward. Because a lot of the broadleaf annual weeds, fat hen, charlock, and spurry, and all of those, red dead nettle, all the usual stuff that you see coming up on a reseed, they once they're decapitated, they will not grow back. They're annual weeds. The alternative, and if there's 150 people tuned in tonight, I'm sure at least half of them are rolling up their eyes at this one, spot spraying. So if you had only sporadic, maybe thistles or docks throughout the new reseed, it is a matter of maybe jumping onto the quad with the knapsack and just going up and down on a dewy morning, going up and down and leaving nice tram lines so that you can see where you've been, and spot spraying those off. So it takes a bit of effort. Next slide, please, Jason. This is just to fine-tune the timing of the post-emergence spray, if we had one available. The photograph on the far left-hand side, first photograph, you can just about see seedlings of grass and clover coming through. That's way too early. And the next, in photograph number 2, I can still see juvenile clover seeds there, which have a flat bottom to them. They are a heart-shaped leaf, not a trifoliate leaf. And yes, there are 1 or 2 trifoliate leaves in the photograph as well. But don't forget what I said earlier, when the majority of the clover plants that you look at in a square yard in front of you have to be at the trifoliate stage. Photograph number 3 is about right. Most of the grasses there have at least three mature leaves, and the clovers are there with trifoliates. And critically, just to the right hand side of the coin in the photograph there, you can see a dock seedling. So that has either come from a little chip of dock plant that has been left in the cultivated seed bed, or it's come from a seedling, or whatever, but we need to be either grazing those off or spraying them out. And the photograph on the right-hand side, it's too far gone. Already that canopy is closing over, and your spray herbicide will be less effective. Next slide, please, Jason. In terms of varieties, and you maybe just move it on again, please. Now, the best way to try and sift through, first of all, clover varieties red clover varieties are still quite scarce. You will not get all of the varieties that are listed in these recommended lists, as in they're not all commercially available. And we struggled with that whenever the ZeroNsile farmers were getting started last summer. But the way to tackle these sorts of recommended lists, if you think back to the start, there was a question mark about clover's longevity. I would go straight to, maybe Jason, you could use the cursor, the total yield at third harvest on the left-hand margin there, and you just scan across there, and anything well above 100, there's 105. That variety is of interest. And you keep going across 106, 108. Those are the varieties, and at the very end, 104. That's the way you're starting to pick out varieties out of the list that are producing even after 3 harvest years. And then there's more data you can sift through as you go down through there, right down as far as protein yields. And you can see some of the lists show actual proteins. There you go. I think you were on it there, Jason. 19% protein, 18, etc., 17. Not that much of a range, to be honest. So I would look more so for the productivity and for good ground cover of clover plants after 3 years. And maybe just move on to the next slide, Jason, time-wise. So just to summarize, the mixtures that we used with the ZeroNsile farmers, they were from 3 different seed houses, but in terms of the quantities, there was a bit of variation there, as you can see. But if you even look at number 1, there's 8, these are all kilos per acre, I must stress. There's 8 kilos of grass, 3 kilos of red clover, and 1 kilo of white clover. So although we're heralding and showing this tonight as a red clover grass crop, we did actually tuck in a small quantity of white clover as well. And the theory of that is that if the clover subsides a little bit after 4 years, or maybe sooner, depends on the variety and the management and everything else. If the clover does start to decline after year 3 or 4, then the white clover should be there actively as well. If the management has been positive for clover, the white clover will still be there, and it will move into the spaces because it's a creeping growth habit. It can do that. So it'll compensate as the red clover declines. So you're still left, even after 4, 5, 6 years, you should still be left, if everything goes well, at the very least, a good, healthy grass white clover sward. And the only variation was at the very end, where we did tuck in, and where requested, put in a kilo of Timothy as well into the mix. Okay. Oh, sorry, the varieties that we used for red clover: Aberclad, Garant, Austro, and Rosetta. Okay, next slide, Jess, please. So that's really all I've got on the establishment. Thought I would just finish off with a few slides on, making the silage, and it'll be interesting to hear what the lads say about how they get on this year as well. The general guidance is all of the bullet points there. First cut, it's based on some of that research that was done around the UK and Ireland over the last number of decades. Mid to late May, with 50% flower buds present in the sward. If you look closely into that photograph, you can see a flower there, but there will also be a large. If there's one flower showing, there'll be a large proportion of flower buds up towards the top of the plant as well. Second point there is a critical one. If you remember nothing else on the slide, take that one home. Avoiding crown damage. If you remember back to the diagram, that crown sitting at or around surface level, soil surface level, so it's vulnerable. That's vulnerable when it comes to outspreading slurry. Certainly when it comes to all of the harvesting operations, if ground conditions are a bit iffy, if there's a slope, if all of the traffic's going through exactly the same point in the field all the time, entry and exit point, that is a problem. So now it's a lot more noticeable if it was a pure stand of red clover, because you could almost see where the tracking has been once the regrowth comes through. It's less noticeable in a grass red clover mix, and that's part of the reason for having the grass there as well, is to add a bit of strength and resistance to the traffic and rolling damage you get from machinery and from grazing. And from a mowing point of view, the main advice there is just try to not scalp it. Again, because of that vulnerable growing point. I keep talking about this growing point. If it's removed, the plant's dead, so it ain't coming back. Allow the crop to flower once per year. So it doesn't really matter whether it's in the first harvest or maybe the second cut, as long as the plant gets an opportunity to release those flowers. It's a bit like grasses going through that seed production phase in June or in late May, early June. It's exactly the same for clover. You want to let it get those seed heads out at some point to regenerate the plant. And with ryegrass, it switches it back to vegetative growth thereafter. 3 to 5 cuts is the norm for these types of swards, 6 to 8 week intervals, weather depending. Again, weather depending. Try to wilt to 35%, and generally the advice is to apply an additive. There's a point there just about PPO, which is polyphenol oxidase enzyme, which is present in red clover tissue. It's an enzyme that's latent and needs to become active. When that enzyme becomes active, it binds to proteins and reduces the degree of degradation of protein and also the lipids to some extent as they pass through the cow's digestive system, through the rumen, and more is available for uptake and absorption in the small intestine. So that's all good news in terms of protein and nitrogen use efficiency and nutrient use efficiency, but that critical PPO enzyme is literally switched on more from and this is where some of the research is showing by wilting first of all, and even with the action of chewing. Whenever the cow is chewing and consuming the silage, the enzyme is switched on to help protect that protein as it passes through. So that's a positive, unexpected consequence of wilting. In terms of practical issues in the field, you can choose either leave it in the swathe or maybe one tedding out, kick it out once, and then it'll just be obviously one raking up. Why are we emphasizing this so much? If you remember back to that photograph of the big bale silage at the start, you will lose those protein-rich clover leaves, and they'll be shattered, and they will be all over the floor of the field. They'll not be in the bale, and they'll certainly not be in the trailer. And you're losing the value. You will not get your high protein silage. So 36 to 48 hours max, very weather dependent in this country of ours and the changeable weather we've had this last number of summers. But leaf loss is the thing to emphasize. I'm getting close to the end here, don't worry. Nutrition is just the one point I wanted to emphasize. For every 1 ton of dry matter harvested of a grass red clover crop, that's removing every time 3 kilograms of P, phosphorus, and 3 kilograms of potassium. A point here on potassium or potash, what we get is luxury uptake with forage species, especially grass. And the ironic thing here is that if you put on a season's worth of potash at some point in the season, there will be a massive uptake because grasses can do what we call luxury uptake. They'll take more than they need. And the ironic thing is that red clover's requirement is actually higher than grass for potash, but the grass will steal a lot of it, basically. So the answer to that is try and have split dressings of potash throughout the season. There's a very high requirement, like I've already said, for potash, higher for red clover. Next slide, please, Jason. So what I wanted to run through was just some very basic tables taken out of the nitrates action regulations booklet along with RB209. But maybe if we just zone in on, if you had a soil index of 2+, if we just look down that column, thanks Jess, for a 2+ soil at grass establishment, take note, you do need phosphate fertilizer, and you'll also need potash fertilizer as well, as we'll see in a moment. But as importantly, that's for establishment, but even for routine use throughout the season, you still need phosphate being applied, 40 kilos, 25, etc., throughout each of the cuts to keep the red clover fueled up and performing to its optimum. And if you just flick to the next slide, please, Jason. The potash requirements, same 2+ soil, let's pretend, and again, 40 kilos at establishment. And then as you go down through the cuts, there's a higher requirement. It was about 40, let's say, at first cut for potash, or sorry, for phosphate. It's about 60 for potash, as you can see, and a bit less as you go through the season. And then if you flick to the next slide to my jotter calculation. Oh, sorry, one more chart. If we're applying slurry, and it's just back one, sorry, just sorry. What we've highlighted in the middle of the chart there, in the middle row, 6% cattle slurry will provide, again, if you're on an index of 2 for consistency here, index of 2 soil, and you're applying, for every cubic meter of slurry you apply, there's 1.2 kilograms of phosphate available for uptake and 2.3 kilograms of potash available. So all of a sudden you're building the picture here. Slurry is quite a natural, well-balanced fertilizer for red clover. And if you flick to the next slide, the jotter calculation should bear this out. If you were applying say 2,500 gallons per acre, old money, divide that by 89, that's about 28, approximately 28 cubic meters of cattle slurry per hectare. Based on the previous charts, that should supply about 34 kilos of available phosphate per hectare and about 65 kilos of available potash per hectare, which isn't that far off what the actual recommendations were for first and second cut. So basically what we're trying to say is that with routine use of your homemade fertilizer, it's ironically it's in about the right ratio. Just by nature, it's in the right approximate ratio for the uptake requirements for an index 2 soil for grasslands, grass production. So you can avoid the fertilizer nitrogen by just making good use of slurry. And I know there's lots of practical implications that would preclude you from making effective use due to weather or distance from the field or whatever. You might have to revert to supplying artificial versions of potash and phosphate as well. So finally, just to sum up, some of the key points maybe to emphasize: weed control. It's all about the preparation before the cultivation is the big emphasis. And there's some cultural control you can do afterwards, and we've got extremely limited options when it comes to chemicals. Soil pH, you should be aiming to get it to at least 6.5. If we're serious about red clover grass swards, you need to be up into that. Remember what happened at pH 5? 0 nitrogen fixation. Don't forget that. P and K are required routinely throughout the grass production season because you're removing so much. And because of luxury uptake by grasses, you need to keep supplying that P and K, but slurry can do that. The fine firm seed bed we've talked about at preparation stage, small seeds right on the surface. We've talked about the varieties, looking for those in particular, I think, that have a really good performance and productivity after the third season. Avoid crown damage, and that has all sorts of practical implications. You need to talk to your slurry spreading team, your contractor team for silage, trying to minimize the traffic damage that occurs across that field. And yeah, that's a challenge. Using slurry nutrients, we've gone into that in some detail. And finally, avoid fertilizer nitrogen. It'll kill your persistency of the clover, and you'll not get nitrogen fixation. Jason, I'll call it to an end there.
Thank you very, very much, David, and good that we got the technical issues resolved. Thank you very much for that comprehensive presentation. I'm now going to invite the two farmers who are with us on the panel if they like to kind of share their open their camera and unmute. I'm going to invite both of them to talk to us just on the experience that they've had in establishing red clover. First of all, with David Clarke, who farms alongside his parents near Aughor in County Tyrone with a dairy herd of 80 spring calving cows, along with a large boiler breeder poultry unit, and Stephen Maguire, farms near Maguire's Bridge, with beef cattle and rearing dairy calves on a contract basis. So, David, can I maybe start with you? Would you like to run over your experiences of establishing and managing red clover to date?
Yeah, look at I'll give you just a brief rundown of 23 establishing, and any questions, just shout, or if you want to tease anything more out of me, just give me a wee nudge. So basically, 23 cut the first cut mid-May. We waited for the regrowth and spread off, and then it was the 7th of June we ploughed, and it was very, very dry at that point. Fast forward, 14th of June, make ready. Lot of emphasis on the pre-rolling, as David alluded to. It did get 2 bags of establishment fertiliser. It was 9.5, 24, 24. It was really all we could get our hands on. And it was then sold with the Einbach on the 15th of June, and it was very, very, very dry. And then it was very, very, very wet. It breaded nicely. The red shank did take over. We did no spraying because just conditions weren't allowing it. It was too wet. On the 16th of August, then we took the first cut. That was really a clean-up cut. Take out that red shank and give the clover more of a chance to get established. Additive is a must in my book, I would say, on that point. But that first cut, 12 acres, was 51 bales. They were wet, but they fed very, very well. On the 15th of December, then, I like getting out with a spade. Root depth was 3 inches. And then fast forward 3 weeks, the root depth was then 6 inches. And then the second cut, it was taken on the 2nd of October, and that was another 60 bales. And just a wee note on your compaction in that, we tried to use the big rake, the 4-rotor rake. They were light cuts, and just to try and minimise that compaction. And over that ground, just to nip off the grass, to let the light down to the base of the sward for the clover. And after that, that's kind of it. We're hoping for a nice, mild, warm summer and plenty of dry, high-protein silage in 2024.
Okay, thank you very much, David. Stephen, do you want to give your roundup of experiences to date?
Yeah, thanks, Jason. My experience maybe started actually off in 2022, to tell the full story. I just tried simply, it was before the project, obviously. 8th of July 22, I just sprayed off the field with Roundup. Left then, 18th of July, I direct drilled, done with the local contractor with the Muir uni drill. And 26th of July then followed with 2.5 bags to the acre of 10, 10, 20. To be perfectly honest, it was a disaster. I think all the guys that were involved in the project have either seen it in person or photos and videos. Absolutely nothing grew. And for what reason to this date, we don't know. So fast forward to 23, I suppose then it was probably just decided that just actual stitching in probably wasn't going to work. Although the field actually had been done previously with just perennial ryegrass, white clover mix that has worked successfully here for me for about 10 years. But anyway, we went with 23, we decided we'd have to do the full reseed. So after having sheep on probably till around the 17th of March, just to clean up whatever debris was there, again, just sprayed off with the Roundup. That was left 3 days until 22nd of April. Calf rearing unit, there was plenty of manure available, so farmyard manure. So it was approximately 100 tonne of that spread. So that was spread at approximately 12.5 tonne an acre. Then on the 2nd of May, that was ploughed in. So it was. That was probably just as the weather was just starting to pick up. Left then until the 15th of May, where it was power harrowed, land levelled. It may be been a little bit sticky, but it just was as good as we thought we could get it at that stage. I may went then kind of against David's advice, went with a bag or a bag to the acre of 10, 10, 20 just for the seed. We reckon like with the farmyard manure being ploughed in, the nutrients wouldn't just be available to the seed. So that was maybe going a wee bit rogue on that one, but that was maybe a bit of discussion with the contractor. We decided to take that approach. Then 17th of May, the following day, it was direct drilled again with the Mirror Unidrill. So that was with a late head-in variety with the Timothy, probably being the most western farmer in this project. We thought that was the variety that would suit us. So then 18th of May, we went down with a bag to the acre of 9.5, 24, 24. Again, sort of like David said, that was really all that was available to us. Just that's maybe a little thing. It's just the availability of those sort of products in small amounts just can be a bit tricky. So you just maybe make do. So something I've had to do maybe which is a little bit different than most guys, and maybe I'll probably touch on it, or it could be touched on later on. My pH is slightly low. It's below 6. Unfortunately, I have what way would we put it to be politically correct and be polite on a webinar? An awkward neighbour, we call him that, who's just basically backs onto the field where ground lime is an issue. So I've had to go with G lime. It'll be probably a 3-year basis. We went in with 2.4 tonne, which is 320 kilos to the acre. So that wasn't ideal, but again, just it's sort of story of farming. I suppose you just have to make the best of it. Then that's as David Clarke mentioned, the weather then sort of picked up from there on in, and when the weather was still good, the weeds and the plant weren't really strong enough or at a stage to actually spray. So then when the optimum time for spraying, the weather obviously had turned, as we all know what 2023 was like. So again, there was a fair weed burden in it. And unfortunately then, we didn't get it mowed until the 8th of August. And again, that was far from ideal because it was sort of a smash and grab job. It was cut on the 8th of August, but we, again, making the best of the situation. We decided just the local contract has the big M. We did cut it at 6 centimetres, but we made the decision to group it to actually just save the ground. It was maybe more a case of save the ground than actually making the best out of the crop that we had. But again, I said that was cut the 8th of August. It was left, it was fairly dry. It got no rain overhead. Baled in on the 10th of August, and that yielded us 7.5 bales an acre. So again, slightly wetter than you would like, but actually no additive used, but it instilled perfectly, has eaten very, very well. So again, it just probably to sum up the whole thing, it probably just didn't go as we would have liked. But listen, we got in, we got out, we didn't do any harm. We then went on the 12th of August. Then again, contractor came in with the dribble bar, the umbilical system. We put 2,500 gallons an acre of watery slurry onto it, and again, things didn't improve weather-wise. So it was 26th of October before we got back in to again a clear up crop, and that was again a row up with a big job and a 12-hour wilt, and that was it. We got 5 bales to the acre at that stage, but again it was ground preservation probably more than anything else. It has ended up being a very extremely wet silage, but I say it's just the best we could do. So that was my experience of it. So the good and the bad and the ugly, as the 2022's effort turned out.
Well, thank you to Stephen and David for, I think you're very honest. You know, if we wanted to start this project and pick a year, we wouldn't have picked 2023, but that's the year we got. And certainly it was challenging, but you know, our farmers got through it there. In terms of questions, and David's been very conscientious, and I see he's been beavering away, typing in responses. David, maybe just kind of maybe go through some of the responses you put in. Obviously, someone asked about the white clover, and that was addressed in your talk. We're putting in the white clover to provide that longer term framework for it. You're talking about obviously the whole crop. Do you want to just comment on that? On the because I know that is sometimes popular to get a clean reseed and undersowing with whole crop silage. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's not one just that I have a lot of direct experience of, but in theory, very useful. The trick with any second crop growing with your red clover is the balancing act. You know, you want to make sure you don't manage and fertilize too much for the whole crop and get it off relatively early to allow the red clover and the grass seedlings to come through. So it's a bit of a balancing act, but the big plus of it is probably one way, a cultural method, maybe, if you want to call it that, to try and get on top of weeds.
Yeah. Okay.
All of those annual weeds, etc., will all be taken away when you take the whole crop off.
Okay, and I see there's a question on N and slurry, and you know obviously the relatively low N and slurry. You don't think there's going to be a major issue for the plant?
Well, look, we can't take it out,
No.
but it's way overshadowed in terms of content. Like I said earlier, it's a lovely natural ratio of P and K, and I should have said earlier, there's sulfur in there as well. So you know it's covering a lot of the bases. And look, we'll take the hit of that little bit of nitrogen, which will fuel some growth, especially for first cut.
And I see, yeah, you've answered the question on the conditioner more, because unfortunately a lot of people don't have maybe much choice but to use a conditioner more. But it is, you know, I suppose just trying to get back as much as you can to minimize that leaf loss, David.
Yeah, I'm not a machinery expert, but I think there must be some adjustment possible with either adjusting the conditioners. I hear about rubber conditioners, maybe are less aggressive, but set the mower in whichever way you can to minimize, not eliminate it, can't do that, but you can minimize the damage and the pulverizing of the crop, and open up the doors obviously as wide as possible. If you're left with a big wide swathe, that could just sit and wilt if you get a really good 2 days of blistering sunshine, fingers crossed. Leaving it in the swathe is perfectly acceptable.
Okay, so I see a few more questions there. Maybe one for the farmers there. Would the farmers do it again or more of it? So Stephen or David, any particular thoughts for either of you on that?
Personally, I would try it again. Yeah, I think to make a full conclusion on 2023 with the weather would be a bit unfair. At the end of the day, I still had two fairly good crops, and cattle loved it. Like, so I think with the benefits both with saving fertiliser and whatever, or it's I think short answer, I think I'd have another go at it. Yeah.
David?
I agree with Stephen too. I think I've asked you for more seeds, but you wouldn't give it to me. So,
I know.
and just a wee point on having a go. Like, the best thing I heard at the start of this process was, at the worst case scenario, I'm left with a field of new grass, So give it a go and see. It does need managed a bit differently, but it's not wildly more complicated. Just a few tweaks in the system, probably.
Okay, thank you. I see a question here from Roy Mayers. Would it be better not to graze red clover, David? And I suppose that's from a purist point of view, you'd say yes, but practicality has.
All right, sorry, my brain was going a different direction with pre and post topping of ewes. There is some evidence, it's not overwhelming, but there's some evidence to keep sheep off at around mating time, because of upsets to hormone balance and fertility and conception and all of that. But actually, sheep can be a very, very useful management option. For if for example you've maybe had 2 or 3 good cuts of silage offered through the main growing season, and then it's actually grown very well in the back end, and it's certainly way beyond silage making time of year. But sheep are quite light of foot, and again, a fast graze with the neighbour's sheep wouldn't be the worst option. So sheep at the right time of year can be very useful.
I suppose it's really just making sure that the stock don't graze the crying root. You know, it's a very light grazing and short and sharp.
Fast graze.
Yeah. Okay, David, a question here about what is the optimum time between cuts? And I suppose, but you want to put a bit about, you know, the needing to let it flower in there. Do you want to maybe talk about that?
Again, first cut, if you let it go through to late-ish part of May, you're this is not for a newly established crop. This is for a second year crop. It's likely in a normal year with day length and triggers and so on, you will get sufficient flower buds at least forming in that first cut. And if you don't, for whatever reason, if it's a quirky season, they'll probably appear in the second cut. And you're looking at the standard sort of weekly, 6-7 week intervals. And that should cover that.
Okay. Is there a risk of introducing ducks into the sward with slurry?
Yeah. There's always some hang-ups with slurry, and look, you do your best with that one. If you think you have and you've seen it before, then you might have to switch. If you've got really duck-ridden slurry and you know it, don't use it. You'd have to switch over to using sources of artificial P and K, and they are available. But the point I was just trying to get to earlier was that you've got a natural fertilizer sitting there.
Okay, there's a question about DMD and protein content. We will be publishing that in due course. We've had some issues with the labs testing and so on, but you know, the proteins have been very respectable on it. We don't really have a DMD because it's wet chemistry we're doing, but we certainly have had good proteins. We'll have more information that in the coming year.
Yeah, and even just on that, typically in
Yeah.
any of the AFBI work we've done over the years, typically you're getting 1 to 2% higher crude protein from side-by-side analysis with grass-only crops, fertilized grass-only crops.
There's a very interesting comment from David Walker here saying, now in my 5th year of red clover, sheep eat more than 20% more of 20% of that compared to grass silage. Never had brilliant silage analysis, but performance seems to contradict this. Is the basic test accurate in red clover? And I think this is probably, Paul, a very valid point. Often these things, red clovers, multi-species swords, they often feed better than they read or analyze. Yeah. David, any comments on that?
I think it's maybe connecting back to the original calibration equations and so on that were done for NAIRS analyses with grass-only type swords, grass-only silages, and then we're putting something different, the different material in and using similar equations. But the general point is, and this is a mixture of reported results in the research literature and anecdotal evidence from farmers and growers, is that it feeds better than it analyzes.
There's a question about how the bale's being fed, stuck that feeder or straight bale out in passage. I think we have a mixture both in our group. Some farmers have been feeding the bales just kind of easy feed alongside others. And the anecdotal information is actually the cows seem to be going for the red clover before they're going for the ordinary grass bales. So both has been done within our group. Can you sow red clover in mid-April if weather permits, David?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's a fairly, yeah. If you had a good April, I think yes. You
Soil
certainly could.
temperature. Soil temperature. A quick plug for your GrassCheck farmers, Jason. The weather stations that we have right around the country now are feeding that data in, and farmers talk to farmers, and the local, you can get a very local soil ground temperature reading without too much difficulty. Once you reach that 8 degrees, I don't care whether it's in the 1st of April or the 21st of April, you can go.
Okay, that's grand. Yeah, and I know quite a few. Some of our farmers kind of did sow out the tail end of April, and that went last year, and that went very successfully. David Johnson from Xlockall has a kind of a question here. In terms of mixtures, a trend to using tetraploid, inter and late perennials because hybrids grow back too quickly after first cuts and need cut, or they go very stemmy while the clover is still at a very mature stage. And this damages clover longevity. So I know in our project we've used, no one went for hybrids. We all kind of went with we did talk about it, but we all went with kind of perennials in terms of tetraploids and diploids. So your standard perennial ryegrass. So David, any comment on David Johnson's point there?
Yes, I agree. I think despite some of the textbook advice advising the use of the hybrids, I think the diploid and tetraploid, if you like, normal perennial ryegrasses in this case are probably easier to manage alongside red clover. Let's face it, what we're presenting tonight, there are already new, fresh challenges for us all if we're switching over to a low nitrogen crop such as red clover. Why make it more difficult with a challenging grass? Let's go with an easier option. I agree with him.
There's a question here about feeding red clover. Has there been any difference in daily live weight gain or meal reduction? I don't think we've kind of done a controlled study on that, but I know if you look on our website, you will find controlled studies from the dairy herd in terms of red clover. So we haven't done that in this particular trial, but on our website, you'll find results of previous studies on red clover at AFBI on that very issue. And finally, Trevor Somerville has asked, is the sulfur in the story enough for the red clover grass mix, or when it's supplemented with calcifert, for example?
Two schools of thought on that. The very principled one would be go by your soil analysis and maybe even a herbage tissue analysis. The belt and braces approach would be put on a +S fertiliser after every cut.
Okay, thank you. And thank you everyone for the questions and so on. I'd just like to highlight we are going to be running farm walks. Our exact dates to be confirmed, but they will be around the end of April and the end of May. And we'll be coming out with more details to those in the coming weeks. So do keep an eye on our website and social media for that. You can go on our website and sign up for an email builds and you get those details. Also a reminder, if you could fill in the survey at the end. So I would just like to hand over to our chairman, Professor Jerry Boyle now. He's going to do a quick sum up and thanks for the webinar. So Jerry, if you want to come on and do a sum up, thank you.
Okay, can you hear me, Jason?
Yeah, we can hear you. Yeah.
I'm not sure. I don't know if you can see me, but anyway, I may spare you that. Okay, right. Look, very briefly, on behalf of AgriSearch, an organization I'm very proud to chair, of course, as Jason said at the beginning of the webinar. It's paid for by Northern Ireland or funded by Northern Ireland farmers, and we'd like to think that we work to ensure that research and innovation, such as you've heard this evening, enables Northern Ireland farmers to be profitable, sustainable, and resilient. So I'd like to, first of all, thanks David Patterson for a really excellent and thorough, and as you said yourself, Jason, comprehensive review of the challenges right through from establishment to ensilement I think we're very lucky to have David working on this ZeroNsile project. And it's clear he has a very practical knowledge of the use of red clover and how to optimize the results. And that's exactly what I think we need from research for practical farming. I thought the two farmers, David Clarke and Stephen Maguire, really underlined the practical challenges, and they also underlined, I think for me anyway, the detailed management requirements of making this a success, as they both admitted, in an extraordinarily difficult year. And they were really, really honest, I think, in outlining the challenges. And again, that's something that I think will be very useful to other farmers. We had a fantastic audience of about 120 people, I think, and that's again really welcome. And I'd also like to emphasize that this whole project is embedded within the wider Beacon Farm network. And in AgriSearch, we're extremely conscious of the willingness of farmers involved in the network to enable other farmers to view their farms and the progress on the different projects. And without that cooperation, this kind of exercise couldn't be possible. So I hope, Jason and everyone, that this year will be a little bit better weather-wise than last year. But I took great comfort from the comment of both Stephen and David that they would do it again. And I think in this particular project, I think while there were challenges, there were really some tremendous positives, because the gains are extraordinary. You know, to think that you can produce a high quality crop that's highly palatable, and that I'm convinced will translate into live weight gain and so on, and productivity indicators with zero chemical nitrogen. That is an extraordinary achievement, and I think it's a gain that is well worth pursuing, and that's what we plan to do with this project, and indeed other projects of a similar nature on the Beacon Farm system. So good night to everyone, and thank you again for participating. Over to you, Jason.
That's it all. Thank you very much, and good night, and please do remember to fill in the survey. Thank you. Good night.